Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going to talk about nuclear power. Now, when I first jumped ship from civil engineering to a new life as a journalist with New Civil Engineer 30 years ago, the magazine was gearing up to celebrate the Sizewell B project, which was being commissioned as the first of a new breed of UK nuclear power stations, albeit somewhat over budget. So I was drawn to last month's announcement by French power firm EDF that the new Hinkley Point C reactor in Somerset, set to be the UK's only new nuclear power station since 1995, will now not open before 2029, possibly not until 2031, and could see costs climb to perhaps £46 billion against an £18 billion original budget. Well, it certainly puts Sizewell B's project delivery achievements into context, which 30 years ago saw costs inflate by around 135%, but is now producing around 3% of the UK's power needs, having taken a mere 7 years to build. Well, the good news is that after decades of dithering, the UK government is now firmly behind nuclear power as a key element in our transition away from fossil fuels, with the Energy White Paper of 2020 demanding at least one large-scale nuclear project to reach final investment decision during this Parliament. And of course, in July last year, we saw the rebirth of Great British Nuclear, a government-owned body designed to coordinate the UK nuclear industry renaissance and drive the development of small modular reactor market. But as always with UK nuclear, it all seems to move at a glacial, hugely expensive pace and continues to beg the question, what on earth is going on with our nuclear and energy transition policy? Well, fortunately, I have with me today one of the UK's authorities on the subject, Tim Stone, chairman of the Nuclear Industry Association and more recently a non-exec director on the new Great British Nuclear team, who I hope will shed some light. So, Tim, you have your NIA chairman's hat on today, I believe. Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Lovely to be with you again.
Well, let's get straight into it, Tim. Nuclear power is reliable, it's sustainable, it's powerful. Yet the reality is that the UK has just 5 operational sites, and by 2028, well, unless there's further operational extensions agreed, there will be just 1. So why has the UK been struggling so much for so long with nuclear, a technology which, after all, we pioneered at Calder Hall in 1956?
We did indeed pioneer it in 1956. And we have always been a great nuclear nation. It's something that one of the previous prime ministers was very proud of. The reality is that you need to do this stuff, like all infrastructure, consistently and continuously, because you need to keep the skills, the supply chain, the expertise. And what's happening down at Hinkley is a heroic effort by the team, and they will get there. But most importantly, I kind of don't care a bit about the time it takes to build and the cost overruns, because if you think about the one you started with, Sizewell B, that is still running. That will still be there in 2054. And by the time it's run to 2054, if you look at the cost of the electricity over its lifetime, it is peanuts by comparison. So what's really important here, standing right back, is that the reason these things take a long time is nothing to do with nuclear. They're just big projects. And if you don't do big projects regularly, you end up having a hard time. And it's interesting that the learning is happening all over the place. To remember, though, of course, you know this as well as anybody else, we're actually not bad at big projects when we have the ability to plan it and prepare for it properly. So the combination is looking very promising, but it's really important that we keep this going now, right, and that GBN keeps the whole process going after Hinkley and Sizewell.
Well, as I'd expect from you, Tim, it's a very, very positive response, and that's great. But we talk about this nuclear renaissance, and I see that there is a huge shift, from the political and the policies perspective, but there's still real doubts about, whether we will meet this target of getting at least one large-scale nuclear project to reach final investment decision during this Parliament. It's by no means a given. I mean, what do you think? Will we get there?
I don't see any reason why not. I mean, Sizewell C is making good progress. Barclays and the team who are looking at private investment into it and making good progress too. Work's already started in the preparation and so on. So actually, it's just about rolling your sleeves up and getting on with it. And what's critical, though, in all this is the trust and confidence in government of whatever hue, whatever politics. What you cannot do is dither. And that's exactly what's been happening for donkey's years. Nigel Lawson had a monumental dither on the back of Sizewell B, and the 9 out of the 10 that Mrs Thatcher wanted to build just sort of evaporated into thin air. And going forwards, I'd just like to remind our gentle listeners that if you search in the Oxford English Dictionary, you will not find a definition of the verb to uncommit.
Right.
You have to get this right. You have to stick to it. And what is very interesting, you talk about the Renaissance. This is all over the world now because the penny's dropped that if you want to find low carbon energy, there's only basically a very small number of sources. Sure, there's renewables, there's hydro, and there's nuclear.
Right.
That's it. That is it.
Well, let's
end off.
Yeah, let's talk about those international comparators because you spent a huge amount of time trying to drive forward nuclear investment. You were advising government back in 2007. Advising investors a long time before that. And you were awarded CBE for your work in 2010 for your passion in this area. But so does it surprise or disappoint you that we've fallen so far behind? Say France, it's got around 18 sites. The US has got over 50 operational sites.
Yeah. It really does disappoint me that we've not had the traction, the political traction. It was, if you go back to 2007, 2010, that period, there wasn't a cigarette paper between government and opposition. Come 2010, we had a coalition government, which is always extremely difficult, but we still got Hinkley through the process despite all that. What we've not done, though, is we've not done the mastermind, I've started, so I'll finish. We have just dithered and mucked around. And I hope now that the recognition is there in the minds of GBN and the current government and indeed the opposition, that around the world, everybody else wants to build a nuclear and we are all competing for the same skills, for the same people, for the same supply chain, not for the same money, because there's plenty of it. But it's really interesting. If I just give you a little colour, there's a Polish group called OSGE, All on Synthos Green Energy. And Synthos is the Polish version of INEOS. And a few years ago, the Synthos guys decided they wanted to put small modular reactors on their chemical plants to provide power and heat. Very sensible. They now have 26 old coal sites where they want to replace the coal power and district heating systems with 79 GE SMRs. So I went for a look around the offices last year, and in a beautiful office right in the middle of Warsaw, there's the Polish guys who are driving it, but if you walk around the floor, guess who all the engineers are? They're Brits.
Right.
They're from Manchester, they're from Sellafield, they're from Somerset, they're from East Anglia, and some of them went from here to Poland, some of them had gone from here to Abu Dhabi and never kind of came back. And we are now in a global competition, and we have to, and the thing that will determine how well we do is firstly trust and confidence in the government, and that is the killer issue. But then after that, it comes down to GBN. It's how GBN solves what is essentially a startup problem for building SMRs, and GBN wants to build small gigawatt ones too. Yeah. So let's not forget all that.
Well, we'll talk about SMRs in a moment, but let's focus now on Hinkley Point and the European pressurized reactor, which is likely to be the technology at Sizewell C2. I mean, the reality is, it's a third generation PWR plants. They're highly innovative, they're highly complex. Perhaps as a result, they've taken much longer and cost much more than expected. We've seen that in Finland, we've seen that in France, and we've seen that in China. So have we hitched our nuclear wagon to the wrong technology?
No, we haven't. What's interesting is that they're, sure, first time through, they're expensive by comparison with what people might think. That's completely standard. The first aeroplane you build of a fleet, the first one's expensive. You learn how to do it and you build a fleet, and that's the critical issue going forwards. Neither China, nor Finland, nor France, nor here has yet built a fleet. And it's the fleet effect that really drives those numbers down. And if you look, for example, at what happened in France on the back of the Mesmer plan and the 58 they built there, they drove prices down. If you look at what the Koreans have done in South Korea, the Japanese, and indeed in some of the Chinese systems, it's all about building a fleet. And that's the critical issue. And that's where it comes back to the dither. So even in the States, they managed to build some relatively sensible fleets there. But we have to stick to this in the way the wind guys have done. And indeed solar, they've built fleets of these things.
Right, yeah. But are you confident then that when we come to build Sizewell C, we will be doing it in shorter than 14 years that we've taken at Hinkley and less than 46 billion that it's going to cost at Hinkley?
Yeah, and this comes down to the lessons learned from Hinkley. So the project director at Hinkley, he's number 2, is now one of the joint managing directors at Sizewell. So the lessons learned are coming across there. You've got Rob Holden as the chair, who's done it with HS1 to budget and slightly early. So you've got the right approach to it. And it's now about doing it properly. I mean, many of our listeners will have seen the book, How Big Things Get Done. That's how you do it. And that's what Rob's doing at Sizewell. And he's building on everything that's been learnt at Hinkley. But I think it's important also just to recognise two things. Firstly, like I said with Sizewell B, You finance these things over 35 years, but they run for donkey's years. Those EPRs may well run for 100 years.
Yeah.
And once you've paid off the finance of the things, it's all upside down the back end. So that the lifetime cost of the electricity of these things is much lower than people realise. And if you look at the impact, and I will give you pause for breath in a minute, if you look at the impact in Finland of Olkiluoto opening, electricity prices have collapsed on the back of that, and it's running 100% capacity factor and just going like a train. And what we have to do is to get the emotion out of all this and just think about the energy system as a whole and how you build a system that works effectively, right, and then stick to doing fleets.
Yeah, well, there's also talk about accelerating plans for Wilfer, using perhaps Westinghouse AP1000 technology, which is perhaps older, but it's more of a tested modular design, perhaps. GBN is trying to buy that site, I believe. So what's stopping that project? What's stopping us pressing ahead with more well-known, well-tested modular technologies?
So if we come back to the beginnings of GBN itself is set up to enable big projects to happen sensibly. It's creating startups. It's got to create some devcos to build a developer capability in the system to build projects, because we haven't got it. It's got to pick some technologies to develop. So there are 4 strands going on in GBN, all of which are there in the public domain if you look really hard. Everybody knows about the SMR tech selection process, which is underway, to pick some SMRs and develop those. But there's a siting process going on. You mentioned Wilver. So underway at the moment is this process to figure out where we're going to build the next set of sites, next big set of projects. Wilver could well be one of them. So that's the second one, siting. The third one is what's known as the consultation on alternative routes to markets, which is looking at ways of getting advanced reactors in. And I just want to talk a bit about advanced reactors in a second. But then the fourth strand, which will start later on this year, is looking at a gigawatt selection process to build some more gigawatt units as well, because to get to 2050 with 25% of our electricity coming from nuclear is a challenge. It's a challenge to get low carbon electricity by 2050 anyway, because we're going to triple probably the total electricity supply as you decarbonise all the heat and the transport. And so you need the whole shooting match. It's not just about SMRs or AMRs. It's about a system in conjunction with wind, with solar and so on. And let me come back to AMRs for a minute, because one of the bits that is rarely properly understood is that advanced reactors, which in the UK terms are not water reactors, include things like some very clever high-temperature gas reactors from organisations like X-Energy, which is building on the pebble bed reactor that the UK developed donkeys years ago. Very elegant, clever solution. There's 500-600 centigrade heat, which is great for making glass and concrete and cement, but also great for making hydrogen catalytically, much cheaper than electrolytic routes. That's one. Right. The other one that's interesting, apart from molten salt reactors, which are clever, is a reactor from TerraPower, which is the Bill Gates business, and he's building for Warren Buffett at the moment. The Natrium project, that gadget, is a frankly quite boring liquid sodium cooled reactor like we have at Dounreay. But what they do is they take the heat from the reactor with the sort of thermal salts that you see in the big towers in Spain and Australia, where you have big fields of mirrors melting salt. They take the heat out with that molten salt, and they use the molten salt to boil the water. And you can turn it up and down like a CCGT. So that could be the balancing gadget for lots of low carbon grids around the world. So we have to think about this big system point, which we should come back to later on.
Which is all, I suppose, this nuclear renaissance is basically bringing all these technologies in and trying to pick the right one for the right particular purpose. And I suppose what GBN's current focus, you mentioned, is the small modular reactor market. And GBN has shortlisted a number of suppliers. What I'm constantly debating with people is how small is small nowadays, because they originally kind of like had pictures on the backs of lorries. They're not on the backs of lorries. They're on the backs of many, many lorries. How big is small for you then nowadays?
So there's a range of scale here for different purposes. So a typical small modular reactor, and I don't like the terminology, typical one is somewhere between 300 and 500 megawatts, which is kind of like an old coal station if you go right back. So they're not that small. They're not pocket jobs. But there are some pocket reactors down at the sort of 5, 10, 20 megawatt level, which are fantastic for off-grid places in the middle of nowhere in Alaska and Canada, where they currently fly in diesel of all horrible things. But for our purposes here, we're talking 300 to 500 megawatt type units.
But the point is that they're modular, they're factory built, they are faster and more effective and more efficient to build. Well, let's drill into that when I expand a little bit more about you, Tim, and what you've been up to over the last goodness knows how many decades. I mean, you've worked in energy policy for quite a large part of your career. Are you now seeing the global need to tackle climate change finally giving this policy area some teeth and breaking down some of the barriers to embracing this technology?
Yeah. There's a recognition that we all of us have to build different energy systems. But yes, there's a clear view that if you're going to hit anything like net zero, you have no choice but to have all those energy mixes in there. And, whilst my day job these days is nuclear, when I worked in Whitehall, I worked on carbon capture and storage. I worked on tidal. I worked on getting financing into renewables. I don't care what it is, as long as it's low carbon, safe and cheap. But cheap means at the level of the national economy, not this little bit here is cheap or that little bit there is cheap, because you can't do this incrementally. You have to think about the overall system in a way that actually very few bureaucrats and politicians understand what the word system means in the way that an engineer does. And it was very interesting. We had Nadeem Zahawi for a bit as an energy minister. Yeah. He did chemical engineering. And when he walked in, I said to him, I'm so delighted you're here because you actually know what the word system means. And he looked at me. I said, you're an engineer. You know what a feedback loop is. You know what Nyquist diagrams are. And he said, my God, I haven't thought about them for years. And I said, I don't care, but you know what the word system means in a way that most people don't. Yeah. And it's that system planning and the system thinking that's critical at the heart of all this. Not 5-year tractor plans, but a big systemic approach to what an energy system would look like to minimise the cost of the national economy. Because what we're doing is we are redefining economic competitiveness of the UK for our children and grandchildren. That's the scale of this. We're making decisions day by day now that will create obligations and consequences that last for generations, maybe 100 years. These things last for a long time, done properly. Big infrastructure is not a 30-second view, because even if, the renewable kit tends to be 25, 30-year useful life, but the consequences of it are a lot longer. You're not going to just throw them away when you finish. You'll end up repowering a lot of the wind and a lot of the solar. So the grid connections matter. So it is that systemic approach which is critical. And I'm as certain as I'm sitting here that the countries that make sensible use of nuclear will end up with a much better balanced grid in most cases where they don't have bucket loads of hydro.
As you say, you have to think about it as a system because all of these bits are interconnected. You spent 7.5 years as a non-exec at Arup. And last year you joined the board of trustees. It's, I suppose, time away from nuclear power, perhaps. I mean, what did you bring to him? What did you learn from a business like Arup?
Well, first of all, my relationship with Arup goes back to the very early days of HS1 when I was at Warburgs. And they're an astonishing organisation. I mean, it's employee-owned. The cultures and the value there are just electric. And being on that board was a real treat. They've got a huge future. They are really creative. Much of the engineering that they've done, that they have pioneered, becomes standard in the industry. And with all the changes that are going on in AI and in energy, they've got huge transitions. The great thing, of course, the trustees are actually the owners. So Arup trustees own the business on behalf of the employees. And to be asked to join the trustees was I almost fell over when I was asked, because it's a huge honour. There are very, very few outsiders ever involved. And, I'm clearly not an Arup type engineer, but they are an amazing organisation. And frankly, being on both the group board for the 7.5 years and now the trustees, I did say when I first joined, it was like being bathed in chocolate by comparison. They are magic.
Well, another of your roles is chairman of Nuclear Risk Insurers, which acts as an underwriting agent for the nuclear industry. Is it focused on new build? Is it on operations? Is it around decommission? Or whole life risks? What part of the business do you get involved in?
We basically cover the whole life cycle of nuclear, not just operations and decommissioning. We're involved, for example, in construction risk insurance. For new build projects like Hinkley. We're looking at how we can play an even bigger part in the whole new build programme. But nuclear risk insurance was set up in 1956 to enable Calder Hall to switch on, because until there was an insurance solution, you couldn't turn it on. And right now, We don't insure in Russia because of sanctions. But other than that, the only places we don't insure all the way around the world are North Korea, Iran, and Argentina, where the state does it. But everywhere else, we insure,
right,
including Fukushima. We insure Ukraine. So all those plants in Ukraine, where they're not occupied by the invading powers, the operational ones, we still insure them.
So there's quite a few very focused minds, presumably, in that business at the moment, yes.
I have to say, the week the invasion happened, there were some very, very focused minds. And Nuclear Risk Insurers itself is the underwriter, but behind us is the might of Lloyd's and some big insurance companies. But we are the big one globally. Selfishly, it's an utter treat. I'm at the position in my career where I can do things I'm interested in with people I like. And I have to say, all of these things tick those boxes exquisitely.
You are ticking many boxes because you also still teach at UCL. You've been a visiting professor there for 14 years and more recently at Bristol University. I mean, why did you do that? What fires you up to do this alongside everything else?
A couple of things. First of all, curiosity. So I never stop learning. I don't think any of us stop learning. And so one of the things I discovered a long time ago, so I taught physical chemistry for one of the Oxford colleges at the end of my DPhil days. And one of the things that teaching makes you do is to really think about what you're teaching. It gives you a different level of understanding to the one that you thought you had before. So I get a real kick out of teaching. I can't do very much because I don't have that much time. But UCL used to have an outpost in South Australia, and I went out there twice a year to teach. And teaching in Adelaide, there are worse places to be. Trust me, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool.
Well, you are a very, very busy chap, Tim. You're just off on a business trip to Canada. You all seem to be travelling across the UK, around the world, talking about energy. But I see you were also a trustee of the London Symphony Chorus Endowment Fund and a member of the Technology Board of the Royal Opera House. Does that indicate that music is your passion away from work? I mean, is that what you do to take your mind off the day job?
It is. So I'm, not that most people realise, but I'm a double bass player in my spare time. And I don't play that many concerts because, again, I don't have time. But when I do, you rock up to a rehearsal and it's all classical. So I'd give my right arm to play jazz, but I play classical double bass in orchestras. And if you think about it, when you're playing, you're having to do things to an accuracy of not many milliseconds. So the level of concentration just means that whatever's in your head to do with work just gets this automatic pressure washer out. And by the time you finish the rehearsal or the concert, whatever was on your brain earlier on about work is just completely gone. And I love playing. I absolutely adore it. It scares the living daylights out of me occasionally. Because despite what might come over on this, I used to be really quite shy. And I will never forget the first big concert I did, which was in Sheffield City Hall. And it was a Christmas concert. And I've been going there every Sunday for rehearsals for about 3 months. Never dawned on me that at the left, beyond the stage, there were actually quite a lot of seats. And I will never forget walking out on the stage with my bass at the beginning of the concert and looking left and seeing 2,500 faces and going, oh my God. And it's electric. I love playing at universities. There were only 2 bass players for the whole of Oxford. And I mean, I got to play sometimes 4 or 5 concerts a week. It's brilliant. So yeah, music is a passion.
Next gig? When's your next gig?
Next gig is, I think, at the end of April. It's
right.
I did one not that long since. It included a piece by an American composer called the Symphony No. 50, Alan Hoverness, and it's about it's a symphonic representation of the Mount St Helens volcano eruption. And I kind of heard it before I played the first rehearsal, but just to my right was this astonishing array of percussion instruments, including a stonking great big bass drum. And when it came to the movement, which is actually trying to depict the actual eruption itself, of course, I'm looking at the conductor and the score, didn't realise the guy to my right had stood there with a whacking great big stick. And when the volcano erupted and he hit that bass drum, I almost fell off my chair, and the hearing went for about 10 minutes. But I'm really lucky. It's been there, all the way through since I left school, and I just love it. It's a great distraction.
No, a chap of many talents. I hadn't seen that coming. So thanks for sharing. Let's get back to nuclear skills. and talk a bit about, what's missing. You mentioned it a bit earlier, but at peak, Sizewell C is expected to provide something like 10,000 jobs across the project's supply chain. I mean, given that our nuclear skills, they've been focused on decommissioning for the last 30 years, and as you said, a lot of the other ones have gone off abroad and are building stuff all over the world. I mean, where's the UK skills? Where are they going to come from? Destination Nuclear, I think, was launched this week, but should we be concerned?
We should only be concerned if people start dithering, because the supply chain for people, we know how to do it. There's about to be a big report from Sir Simon Bonham on what skills we need and how to create them for both civil and defence nuclear in the UK, and that's also looking at what's needed in Australia, because we are going to end up working with them. What matters is that there's confidence for people, because to be a nuclear engineer, this isn't about sending people off to go learn quantum mechanics as opposed to structures. You're just building in a nuclear context. Most of what goes on is completely standard elsewhere in the system. And the only difference is that you have a higher safety expectation. And so it's just a different style of behaviour. And there are some special skills, but the vast bulk of people on those sites are normal people. And it's how we attract people from all the other industries into nuclear, how we take industries that are fading and sunsetting, some of the old metal bashing manufacturing industries. We need people to move into nuclear. And destination nuclear is a great way of getting people to realise the opportunity. One of the things about nuclear careers is that they last for a very long time, and they're careers on which you can build a family, from which you can build a community for generations. And if you look at the existing nuclear sites, and for example on Anglesey, the people of Anglesey who worked on Wilver and all their families, they just want more projects. Teesside, Moorside, they all want more projects because they realise the value that these jobs brings to the community. And the take-home pay on a nuclear site is usually quite a lot higher. Nuclear produces jobs of a quality that you almost don't see anywhere else, and certainly not with that longevity.
Well, I suppose when it comes to energy transition, there are clearly also huge competitors, for resources. For the government's ambition to develop 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and take solar capacity from 15 gigawatts to around 70 by 2035. I mean, these are big competitors, and I hear what you say about there being slightly different skills, but how does nuclear make the case to those skills, but also to the investors and the developers to get stuck in?
Let's come back to skills first of all. What's critical here is that we all recognise that we're not competing. So you'll see from the NIA, we never knock any competition from other energy sources, because every single one of them is necessary. So it's about how we cooperate, how we all help each other grow that skill base as we all need it. Because if we don't do that as a nation, we are screwed. We are basically screwed in terms of that energy transition. It's all across the piece. It's how we transition the economy to an energy-focused economy, because the jobs around all this are just gold dust for a long time.
It's back to that system again. I mean, we've also got this other, I suppose I call it an insane reality, that regardless of this ambition to add low carbon and renewable generation capacity, the ability of the grid to manage the increase is going to remain a limiting factor unless we really get on and start building these connections. I mean, we're most likely going to be paying an annual bill of perhaps £3 billion to developers not to generate that power. I mean, is that likely to be a constraint to the UK nuclear ambition?
I think one of the things that the government's going to have to think about really, really hard is the whole planning process, because the poor old guys in grid can wait a decade to get permission to put up a new string of pylons. I mean, that's stupid in terms of the consequence to the national economy. We have to find a way of getting the grid where it needs to be as fast as it possibly can be to wire all this lot up. And it is an issue for the politicians in terms of making the case to the public that, frankly, guys, we have to do this. And if we don't do it, whilst you might see construction work going on as these things are put up, if you don't do it, it's your children and grandchildren who will not just suffer, but I'll take bets that if we don't get this right, the best and the brightest and the ones who are able to will emigrate to other countries where they're doing it better. It is this sort of geopolitical challenge, I think, globally, because we are redefining that economic competitiveness. We don't have any choice. So at the back of this, the whole planning process needs a really, really hard look, and something where at the moment, it's just an awful process. If you think back to Hinkley, the planning documents that went in, it was 20,000 pages of documents and 30,000 pages of appendices delivered in a damn great truck. I mean, that's a surfeit of democracy. That's just nuts.
Well, let's get into that, because you started your career in finance and investment banking. And when you speak to investors in the energy sector, the biggest frustration, they say, the biggest issue detracting them from investing in the market is lack of policy clarity and lack of policy consistency. And I suppose when you talk about planning, in many ways that comes into that. I mean, is that changing in the nuclear sector? Is it changing fast enough?
That's a really hard one. And it comes down to what the politicians are going to do in the next 3 to 5 years, frankly. There's a recognition, I think, in the investor community that nuclear is a critical part of it. So the nervousness about nuclear in the past, I think, is very heavily faded. And you can see that when Brookfield sold pretty much half of Westinghouse to Cameco for an eye-watering amount of money. So there's a recognition of the value in there. In terms of the willingness to invest in projects, that's going to come down to the way in which projects are delivered. Now, Abu Dhabi built their projects pretty much on time and on budget. But, they did it from a standing start. If you go back a few years, the Canadian reactor, the CANDU, was built not only in Canada, but in Argentina, Romania, South Korea, China, on time and on budget, over again. Investors love that. And what we have to do is to show that we can do this and that this is a great place for the investors to come. Because for nuclear projects, I mean, these are projects with huge durations, which beautifully match what pension funds need in terms of their liabilities and their assets. I mean, it's a really, really classic combination. And the thing that politicians, I don't think necessarily always understand, is that as a banker, you don't price political risk. You tolerate it for a bit and then you say no.
Yeah.
And it is that discontinuous function. How do politicians stay to the right side of it and both create and then absolutely maintain that trust? Because once you've lost it, it'll take a good decade to get back again.
Well, look, finally, we're in an election year. I mean, despite Labour's recent backtracking on the 28 billion green investment number, I mean, all parties are committed to energy transition. Where do you see the party dividing lines when it comes to nuclear policy? Are there any, or is everybody pretty much on the same message on that one?
They're absolutely in the same place. And it was interesting, if you look very carefully at what the Labour Party said when they were talking about the 28 billion, they were very clear that it has no effect on their commitment to nuclear. It's interesting that, Ed Miliband was Secretary of State in DEC in his last job, and he saw this at first hand and saw the value. And I can quite see the Great British Nuclear becomes a really good template for what he wants to do with Great British Energy. But it comes back to my point earlier on. Great British Energy, it may well be the answer to my system planning approach, the guiding mind behind it all. And I frankly, as far as I can see, there's no political risk between the parties. That's not an issue for me any longer.
Well, they did say that about HS2 as well, though, Tim, so don't hold your breath. So anyway, let's not digress. Finally, give us a number. Today, nuclear power contributes, 15 to 20% of our power requirements, something like 5 gigawatts. What do you think the number might be in 10 years' time?
I'm not going to do 10 years' time because that depends entirely on how fast we can ramp up that supply chain. But let's just assume away for a minute the idea that GBN can actually crank this stuff through. We need to get to about, for a balanced system, it'll be somewhere of the order of 25% of the total energy demand. And by 2050, that energy demand is probably going to be about 2.5 to 3 times the current electricity system. So it's a big build, which is why it needs gigawatt scales and SMRs. But I wouldn't be surprised in the end if that 24 gigawatts that we're looking at now, if we can do it, might even grow to 45 or 50. And it's really interesting when you look at some of the modelling, the properly independent modelling that's being done. There's a group called Carbon Free Europe, and the website is, oddly enough, carbonfreeeurope.org. And if you have a look at their predictions on what they think of as a systematic basis across Europe, including all the interconnectors and treating Western Europe as a common system, they're looking at over 50 to 60 gigawatts in nuclear.
Right.
And the limiting factor is simply going to be how fast and how slick can you make that fleet build, and how do you design in the first place that balanced system. And it's not about a micrometer measurement. It's not about getting it down to the last third decimal place. My research supervisor, because I used to measure spectral lines with a travelling microscope to incredible precision. And Dickie used to say, you don't need that sort of precision to know what the spectrum is. You need a notch stick. And that's how we have to approach the energy system as a whole. If you get it about right, that will do fine.
But a tenfold increase, though. A tenfold increase is what you think?
Potentially, yeah. But it's certainly going to be a good fivefold increase as a minimum. And it really comes down to how fast we can do this.
And that's what the learning that's going on at Hinkley at the moment will be rolled out at Sizewell and then go on from there as that system. Tim, it is a very interesting, a very challenging, a very complex subject. So thanks so much for sharing your thinking with me today. I'd like to leave it on a very positive note as well. And your positive outlook there is very good to have. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for the therapy. It's been fascinating.
Thanks, Tim. Well, that's all we've got time for today, but we have got more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline, more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you will find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Tim, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.